Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The words stayed inside. Have you ever wondered why saying two simple words, "I'm sorry," can feel harder than learning thousands of English words? If your heart has ever been heavy with regret, if you've ever stayed silent because pride felt safer than honesty, or if you've ever wanted to improve your English while listening to a story that feels real, then stay with me. Today, I'll share the most important lesson I learned after building a new life, a marriage, and a family in the United States. Surprisingly, it wasn't English that challenged me the most. It was learning how to say, "I'm sorry." When I first arrived in the United States, everything looked exciting. The streets were wide. The neighborhoods were quiet. The seasons changed so clearly that even the trees seemed to have their own emotions. Spring brought soft green leaves. Summer filled the parks with laughter. Autumn painted every street with red and golden colors. Winter covered everything with snow so white that it almost looked unreal. I believed adapting to a new country would mostly mean improving my English. I downloaded language apps, listened to slow English reading videos every morning, repeated simple sentences while driving to work, and practiced speaking whenever I ordered coffee. Every new word felt like another small victory. But life had prepared a much harder lesson for me. After getting married, I slowly realized that communication is much more than vocabulary. My husband and I rarely had big arguments. Instead, we had something much more dangerous: long silences. They usually began with tiny misunderstandings. Maybe I forgot to answer a message. Maybe he expected me to notice he had a difficult day. Maybe I assumed he already understood how I felt. None of these moments seemed important at first. Yet each one quietly built another invisible wall between us. The strange part was that I could confidently pronounce difficult English words like responsibility or communication. But when the moment came to simply say, "I'm sorry," my voice disappeared. It wasn't because I didn't know the words. It was because my heart was afraid. I worried that apologizing meant losing. I worried people would think I was weak. I worried that if I admitted I was wrong, my opinion would no longer matter. Looking back now, I smile at that version of myself because I finally understand something I didn't know then. Pride speaks loudly, but love usually whispers. Life in America taught me many beautiful things. I learned that neighbors often smile even if they don't know your name. Teachers encourage children to ask questions without fear. Many workplaces value honest conversations more than perfect answers. These small cultural experiences slowly changed me, but changing old emotional habits took much longer. Every evening, after work, I would sit in the living room with a cup of tea, listening to slow English stories while wondering why expressing feelings seemed more difficult than learning grammar. Psychologists often explain that our brains naturally protect our self-image. When we make mistakes, our minds quickly create excuses because accepting responsibility feels uncomfortable. This is sometimes called self-serving bias. It happens to almost everyone. Understanding this helped me stop judging myself so harshly. I realized I wasn't a bad person. I was simply human. And humans often protect their pride before protecting their relationships. One rainy evening changed everything. It had been raining since the afternoon, one of those gentle American rains that quietly tap against the windows without making much noise. The house felt peaceful, but inside my heart there was a storm. My husband was reading on the sofa. I wanted to walk over and apologize for an argument we had several days earlier. I stood in the kitchen pretending to wash the same coffee mug again and again, hoping somehow the perfect words would appear by themselves. They never did. That night I discovered something surprising. The hardest conversation in life usually begins before you open your mouth. It begins inside your own mind. The battle isn't between you and another person. It's between fear and courage, between pride and love, between staying silent and choosing connection. If you're learning English today, I hope you'll remember this. Every sentence you practice can help you communicate with the world, but the simplest sentences often carry the greatest power. Thank you. I understand. I forgive you. And perhaps the bravest sentence of all.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know it then, but those two simple words were about to change not only my marriage, but also the way I understood love, family, and even myself. And that journey began with one quiet evening, one deep breath, and one sentence I had spent far too many years avoiding. A small argument, a long silence. No one ever tells you that the most dangerous storms inside a marriage often begin with something so small that you can barely remember how it started. Looking back now, I honestly can't remember the exact words that caused our argument, but I can remember every painful moment that followed. Sometimes people don't stop talking because they have nothing to say. They stop talking because every sentence feels heavier than the last. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in early autumn. The air outside was cool, and bright orange leaves were collecting along the sidewalks of our quiet neighborhood. I had just returned home after a long day at work. Like many families in America, both of us worked full-time, so evenings became our only chance to slow down and enjoy being together. At least that was the plan. Reality looked very different. Dinner was simple. We sat at the kitchen table with grilled chicken, vegetables, and warm bread from a nearby grocery store. The television was off. The house was peaceful. From the outside, anyone passing by would have thought we were a happy couple enjoying a quiet evening. Inside the room, however, something invisible had already begun to grow. My husband casually asked if I had remembered to call the insurance company about a family document. I froze for just a second before answering that I had completely forgotten. He sighed, not loudly, not dramatically, just one small sigh. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but somehow it sounded much louder inside my head. My brain immediately translated that sigh into criticism. Instead of hearing disappointment, I heard judgment. Instead of hearing concern, I heard failure. Without thinking, I became defensive. I explained how busy my day had been. I reminded him about everything else I had already done that week. I even brought up things completely unrelated to the conversation. Isn't it strange how quickly the human mind searches for evidence that we deserve to be right? Psychologists explain this as a natural defensive response. When our self-esteem feels threatened, our brains often protect our ego before protecting our relationships. The conversation ended faster than it began. Neither of us yelled. Nobody slammed a door. Nobody said anything cruel. We simply stopped talking. At first, the silence felt temporary. I assumed one of us would apologize before bedtime. But bedtime arrived, and nothing happened. The next morning, we exchanged only practical sentences. Coffee is ready. I'm leaving now.
See you tonight.
Every word was polite, but none of them carried warmth. It was amazing how two people could speak the same language, yet feel completely disconnected. As the days passed, I noticed something surprising. Silence is exhausting. It follows you into every room. It sits beside you during breakfast. It rides in the car with you. It even waits beside your pillow when you try to sleep. The house became quieter than ever before, yet my thoughts became louder every single day. Ironically, I continued practicing English during this time. Every morning, I listened to slow English reading stories while driving to work. The narrator spoke calmly about kindness, patience, and communication. I repeated every sentence with perfect pronunciation. Honesty builds trust. Forgiveness brings peace. Love grows through understanding. The words sounded beautiful through my headphones. Living them inside my own home felt much more difficult. One evening I noticed our little daughter quietly coloring at the dining table. She looked back and forth between us several times. She didn't ask why we weren't laughing anymore. She didn't ask why dinner felt different. Children rarely need explanations. They simply notice everything. That realization hit me harder than the argument itself. Our silence wasn't private anymore. It had become part of our family's atmosphere. Research in family psychology suggests that children often learn emotional habits by observing their parents rather than listening to advice. That thought stayed with me all night. If our daughter grew up believing silence was the normal response to conflict, what kind of relationships would she build one day? Suddenly, winning the argument no longer seemed important. Still, pride refused to disappear. Every time I considered saying, "I'm sorry," another voice inside me whispered, "But what if you're not completely wrong?" That single question kept me trapped. I wasn't waiting for the perfect moment anymore. I was waiting to feel completely justified before apologizing. The problem was that perfect certainty never came. Looking back now, I realize our biggest mistake wasn't the forgotten phone call. It wasn't the misunderstanding. It wasn't even the silence. The real mistake was believing that someone had to lose before the relationship could win. Love doesn't keep score the way pride does. I had no idea that courage would soon arrive from the most unexpected place, and when it did, it would completely change the direction of our marriage. I was learning more than English. What if the biggest mistake in your life isn't a grammar mistake, but an emotional one? I used to believe that if I could speak English fluently, life in America would become easier. I thought confidence would arrive with every new vocabulary word, every perfect pronunciation, and every successful conversation. But one ordinary morning taught me something completely unexpected. The sentence that changed my life wasn't difficult at all. It contained only 2 words, yet my heart still refused to say them. Several days had passed since our argument, and our home still felt unusually quiet. Everything looked normal from the outside. The dishes were washed. The laundry was folded. Our schedules continued as always. We smiled politely when necessary, but our conversations had become little more than daily routines. It was amazing how 2 people could live under the same roof while feeling like strangers walking through the same airport, passing each other without really stopping. Every morning, I continued my English practice before leaving for work. I loved listening to slow English reading because the calm voice helped me relax before a busy day. That morning, the speaker said something simple. Real communication begins when people stop trying to win. I repeated the sentence several times to improve my pronunciation. Then I suddenly stopped the recording. Those words didn't just sound beautiful. They sounded painfully personal. For the first time, I asked myself an uncomfortable question. Was I actually trying to solve our problem, or was I secretly trying to prove that I was right? Our brains are fascinating. According to psychologists, people naturally remember evidence that supports their own opinions while ignoring information that challenges them. This mental shortcut helps protect our confidence, but it can quietly damage relationships. As I reflected on our argument, I realized I had replayed only the moments where I believed my husband had misunderstood me. I had almost completely ignored the moments when he may have felt hurt by my words. That realization stayed with me throughout the day. During lunch, I noticed something that reminded me why I had always admired American workplaces. 2 coworkers accidentally made the same mistake on an important project. Instead of blaming each other, one simply smiled and said, "That's on me. I'll fix it." The other answered, "No problem. We'll solve it together." The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. There was no drama.
No embarrassment.
No competition. Everyone simply moved forward. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why did apologizing seem so natural in that office, but feel almost impossible inside my own home? The answer slowly became clear. In public, mistakes often feel temporary. At home, mistakes feel personal. When emotions are involved, we begin protecting our identity instead of protecting the relationship. We confuse being wrong with being unworthy. But those two things are completely different. That evening, while driving home beneath the golden light of a beautiful American sunset, I turned off the radio and drove in silence. The roads stretched ahead, lined with tall trees already preparing for another autumn. Everything outside looked peaceful, yet inside my mind hundreds of thoughts competed with each other. One voice kept repeating, "He should apologize first." Another whispered something much quieter. "Maybe someone simply needs to be brave first." Sometimes courage doesn't arrive like lightning. Sometimes it arrives like a tiny question that refuses to leave your mind. When I opened the front door, I found my husband helping our daughter practice her reading homework. She struggled with one sentence and quietly said, "I made a mistake." He smiled gently. "That's okay," he told her. "Mistakes help us learn." She smiled, corrected the sentence, and continued reading with confidence. I stood there without saying a word. It suddenly felt almost ironic. We were teaching our daughter that making mistakes was completely normal, yet as adults we were terrified of admitting our own. Children fall, stand up, and try again without embarrassment. Adults often carry invisible backpacks filled with pride, fear, and unnecessary expectations. Scientists who study emotional intelligence often explain that healthy relationships are built less on avoiding conflict and more on repairing it.
Quickly.
Every disagreement offers two possible directions. One path leads toward distance. The other leads toward deeper trust. The difference is rarely the size of the problem. It's the willingness of someone to take the first step. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my notebook where I usually practiced English vocabulary. Instead of writing new words, I wrote one simple sentence again and again.
"I'm sorry."
The grammar was easy. The pronunciation was easy. Even I didn't know it yet, but before another sunset arrived, life was about to place me in a moment where silence would no longer be an option. And the next decision I made would quietly shape the future of our family. The hidden weight of pride. Have you ever noticed how your heart can know the right thing to do, while your mind keeps inventing reasons not to do it? That was exactly where I found myself. Every day I became more certain that I should apologize, yet every night I discovered another excuse to wait until tomorrow. The strange part was that I wasn't fighting with my husband anymore. I was fighting with myself, and somehow that battle was even more exhausting. The next few days passed quietly, almost too quietly. Outside, our neighborhood looked as peaceful as ever. Children rode their bicycles after school. Neighbors waved while walking their dogs. Delivery trucks stopped in front of houses exactly on schedule. America often felt beautifully organized, and I admired that rhythm of everyday life. We prepared meals together without really talking. We discussed grocery lists, bills, and our daughter's school schedule. We communicated like responsible adults, yet we had stopped connecting like best friends. One evening, I caught myself doing something almost ridiculous. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror practicing the sentence, "I'm sorry." I whispered it once, then again, then louder. It sounded natural. It sounded sincere. It sounded exactly the way I wanted it to sound. But the moment I imagined saying those same words to my husband, my chest became tight. My heartbeat accelerated. Suddenly the sentence that had felt so simple only seconds earlier became almost impossible. Later that night I searched for articles about why apologizing feels so difficult. What I discovered surprised me. Researchers in psychology explain that the human brain often treats social rejection almost like physical pain. In other words, our brains sometimes confuse vulnerability with danger. Reading those studies didn't magically solve my problem, but they helped me understand that I wasn't weak. I was experiencing something incredibly human. The funny thing was that I had always encouraged other people to apologize quickly. If a friend asked for relationship advice, I would confidently say, "Don't let pride become more important than love." Giving advice was easy. Living by that advice was a completely different story. Isn't that one of life's greatest ironies? Sometimes the person giving the smartest advice is secretly struggling to follow it themselves. The following Saturday, our family decided to visit a local farmer's market. It had become one of our favorite weekend traditions since moving to the United States. Fresh apples, homemade bread, colorful flowers, local honey, and musicians playing soft country songs created an atmosphere that always made the community feel warm and welcoming. As we walked between the small stands, I noticed an elderly couple holding hands. Their steps were slow, and their hair had turned completely white, yet every few minutes they smiled at each other as if they had just fallen in love. For some reason, I couldn't stop watching them. I quietly wondered how many disagreements they must have experienced over the years. Hundreds? Thousands? Surely they had argued about money, children, work, and countless little misunderstandings. Yet here they were still walking side by side. It suddenly occurred to me that long-lasting love isn't built by avoiding mistakes. It's built by repairing them over and over again. While I was lost in my thoughts, our daughter suddenly ran toward a flower stand. She accidentally bumped into a display, causing several small flower pots to wobble. Before anyone else reacted, she looked at the owner and softly said, "I'm sorry." The woman smiled immediately. "It's okay, sweetheart," she replied warmly. "Thank you for telling me." That was it.
No lecture. No anger. No embarrassment.
Just forgiveness. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, yet it stayed in my mind for hours. Children often teach adults lessons without realizing it. My daughter hadn't spent 10 minutes deciding whether apologizing would make her look weak. She simply recognized a mistake and chose kindness. Somewhere along the road to adulthood, I had made something beautifully simple feel unbelievably complicated. That evening, as the golden sunlight disappeared behind the trees, I finally admitted a truth I had been avoiding. My husband wasn't the wall standing between us. My pride was. The silence filling our home wasn't growing because love had disappeared. It was growing because fear kept speaking louder than love. The more I protected my ego, the more I slowly damaged the very relationship I was trying to protect. I stood by the living room window watching the first stars appear above our neighborhood. For the first time in days, I stopped asking whether I deserved an apology too. Instead, I asked a completely different question. What kind of person do I want to become? That single question changed everything. Because once you stop trying to win an argument, you finally become free to save the relationship. I took one deep breath, turned toward the kitchen where my husband was quietly making tea, and realized that the next few minutes would become one of the most unforgettable moments of my entire life. One quiet conversation. Sometimes the moment that changes your entire life doesn't arrive with loud music, dramatic speeches, or perfect timing. Sometimes it begins with the sound of a kettle boiling in a quiet kitchen. I used to believe that fixing a relationship required finding the perfect words. I was wrong. What we truly needed was one honest conversation, one open heart, and the courage to stop hiding behind silence. That evening, I finally discovered that love grows strongest when pride becomes quiet. The kitchen smelled like fresh chamomile tea. Outside, The evening sky above our neighborhood had turned soft shades of orange and blue. It was one of those peaceful American evenings when everything seemed to slow down. Cars passed quietly outside. A gentle breeze moved the trees in our front yard. Inside the house, my husband stood by the counter, carefully pouring hot water into 2 mugs. We had shared hundreds of evenings in this kitchen before, yet this one somehow felt completely different. My heart was beating much faster than usual, and I knew I had reached the point where staying silent would hurt more than speaking honestly. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Silence can feel uncomfortable, but sometimes it gives courage enough time to arrive. I walked toward the table and quietly sat down. My husband placed 1 cup of tea in front of me without saying a word. That simple gesture reminded me that kindness had never disappeared from our marriage. It had only been buried beneath layers of disappointment and misunderstanding. I wrapped both hands around the warm cup, took a slow breath, and finally spoke.
I'm sorry.
The words were softer than I expected. There was no dramatic background music. No perfect speech. Just 2 simple words. For a brief moment, the room stayed completely still. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, to list all the reasons why I had reacted the way I did. But something inside me whispered, just let the apology breathe. So I stayed quiet. A few seconds later, my husband looked at me and smiled gently. I've been waiting to hear that, he said calmly. And I'm sorry too. I blinked. That wasn't the response I had imagined. For days I had convinced myself that apologizing meant accepting all the blame. Instead, my apology had created space for another apology. Suddenly, we weren't opponents anymore. We were simply 2 imperfect people trying to take care of the same relationship. Psychologists who study healthy marriages often describe something called emotional repair. Research has shown that successful couples are not those who never argue. They are the couples who repair emotional distance before resentment becomes permanent. The repair itself doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it begins with eye contact. Sometimes with a smile. Sometimes with 1 sincere sentence spoken at the right moment. That evening, I experienced that truth for myself. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about who had been right. Not about who had started the disagreement. Instead, we talked about how tired we had both been. We talked about balancing work, raising our daughter, paying bills, planning for the future, and quietly carrying worries that neither of us had fully shared. For the first time in a long while, we weren't trying to solve each other. We were trying to understand each other. Listening, I realized something that surprised me. My husband hadn't been angry because I forgot 1 phone call. He had felt alone, and I hadn't been upset because of his sigh. I had felt unappreciated. Those emotions had been hiding underneath the argument all along. Researchers often explain that conflict usually begins on the surface, but emotions live much deeper. People argue about dishes, schedules, money, or forgotten errands. Underneath those everyday problems are much more personal questions. Do you see me? Do I matter to you? Can I still feel safe with you? Once we answered those hidden questions honestly, the original disagreement suddenly became very small. At one point, we both started laughing. It almost felt unbelievable. Only a few days earlier, our home had been filled with silence. Now, we were sharing memories from when we first met, smiling about awkward dates, laughing at funny mistakes we had made while building our life together in America. It reminded me that love doesn't disappear during difficult seasons. Sometimes it simply waits patiently beneath hurt feelings until someone chooses to uncover it again. Our daughter quietly walked into the kitchen wearing her pajamas. Children notice emotional weather just as easily as adults notice sunshine. That smile reminded me that healing one relationship often heals the atmosphere of an entire home. Before going to bed, I looked once more at the notebook where I had written the words, "I'm sorry," again and again the night before. This time, I closed it. I didn't need to practice those words anymore. I had finally lived them. And although I believed the hardest part of our journey was now behind us, I had no idea that learning to apologize was only the first lesson. It quietly transforms every tomorrow. Have you ever noticed how one honest conversation can make a house feel brighter the very next morning? Nothing about our home had physically changed. The walls were the same. The furniture hadn't moved. The weather outside was still cool, and the same coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen. Yet everything felt lighter. That was the moment I realized something surprising. A sincere apology doesn't just change a relationship, it changes the emotional atmosphere where everyone lives. And science explains exactly why. The morning after our conversation, I woke up before sunrise. For the first time in many days, I didn't feel a heavy weight on my chest. Instead of replaying old arguments in my mind, I found myself listening to the quiet sounds of the house waking up. Birds gathered outside our window. It was such a small moment that many people would probably overlook it, but after days of silence, it felt like sunshine after a long winter. As I drove to work through the peaceful streets of our American neighborhood, I kept thinking about what had changed. We hadn't solved every problem in our lives. We still had bills to pay, responsibilities to manage, and busy schedules waiting for us. Yet the stress felt different because we were carrying it together instead of carrying it separately. That may be one of the greatest gifts of marriage. The challenges don't disappear. They simply become lighter when two people stop standing on opposite sides. Later that day, I became curious and started reading more about forgiveness and apologies. Researchers studying relationships have found that sincere apologies reduce emotional tension because they help the brain feel psychologically safe. Again, when people feel understood, the body's stress response begins to calm down. Levels of stress hormones gradually decrease, while feelings of trust and emotional connection begin to return. In simple words, kindness is not only good for the heart emotionally, it also helps the body relax physically. The more I learned, the more I realized that apologizing isn't about proving weakness. It is actually an act of emotional strength. Anyone can protect their pride. It takes real courage to protect a relationship. That evening, my husband and I prepared dinner together. Usually one of us cooked while the other cleaned the kitchen, but this time we naturally worked side by side. We laughed when I accidentally added too much pepper to the soup. A week earlier, that small mistake might have become another source of frustration. This time, we simply smiled and fixed it together. The difference wasn't the soup. The difference was us. Our daughter sat nearby finishing her homework. Every few minutes, she looked up to tell us about something she had learned at school. Her voice sounded brighter than it had in days. Children often respond to emotional safety without even realizing it. Family psychologists frequently explain that children don't only listen to conversations. They absorb emotional patterns. When parents communicate with patience and respect, children slowly begin to build those same habits inside themselves. That realization stayed with me throughout the evening. I wasn't apologizing only for my husband anymore. I was also creating the kind of home I hoped our daughter would remember many years from now. Maybe one day she would face conflict in her own relationships. Maybe she would remember that disagreements are normal, but staying trapped inside pride is optional. One weekend, while walking through a beautiful community park filled with colorful autumn leaves, we noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench feeding birds. As our daughter happily chased squirrels across the grass, the man smiled and said something I will never forget. "I've been married for 52 years, he told us. The happiest couples aren't the ones who never argue. They're the ones who never stop choosing each other after the argument. Those words stayed with me long after we left the park. Life in America had taught me many practical things: how to drive in snow, how to understand different accents, how to adapt to new traditions, and how to improve my English every single day. But none of those lessons changed me as deeply as learning the quiet power of a sincere apology. Language helped me communicate with people. Humility helped me truly connect with them. That night, before going to bed, my husband reached for my hand without saying anything. There was no need for a long conversation. Some moments speak more clearly than words ever can. I smiled because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Love is not measured by the number of perfect days two people share. Love is measured by how gently they find their way back to each other after imperfect ones. As I turned off the bedroom light, I believed our greatest lesson had already arrived. But life still had one more surprise waiting for us. Soon I would discover that the people learning the most from our changed relationship weren't just the two of us. Every small act of kindness was quietly shaping the future of the little girl sleeping peacefully in the room across the hall. Our children were watching. What if the most important conversation in your family isn't the one you have with your children, but the one they quietly watch you have with each other? That thought stayed with me long after our apology. I believed our daughter was too young to notice the tension that had filled our home. I couldn't have been more wrong. Children may not understand every word adults say, but they understand emotional silence better than we think. The lesson she was learning had nothing to do with English. It was about love, respect, and what a healthy family truly looks like. The days after our reconciliation felt surprisingly peaceful. The house sounded different again. Music played softly while we prepared breakfast. We laughed over small mistakes instead of becoming frustrated. Even our morning routines felt lighter. Every weekday before school, our daughter would sit at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal while I practiced slow English reading for 20 minutes. Sometimes she repeated simple words after me. Sometimes she simply listened with a smile. Those quiet mornings slowly became one of my favorite parts of living in the United States because they reminded me that learning happens naturally, when people feel safe. One Saturday afternoon, something happened that I will never forget. We were baking chocolate cookies together, one of our family's favorite weekend traditions. The kitchen quickly became messy. Flour covered the counter. Chocolate chips rolled across the table. Our daughter accidentally knocked over a measuring cup, spilling sugar onto the floor. She froze immediately and looked at both of us with wide eyes. For just a second, nobody moved. Then she looked down and softly whispered, "I'm sorry." Before I could respond, my husband smiled warmly. "It's okay," he said. "We'll clean it up together." Our daughter smiled with visible relief. Within seconds, the three of us were laughing while sweeping sugar into a dustpan. The accident disappeared almost as quickly as it had happened. But something much bigger had happened without any of us realizing it. Our daughter had learned that mistakes do not end relationships. They begin conversations. That simple moment stayed with me all weekend. Developmental psychologists often explain that children build emotional security by watching how adults respond to mistakes. When children see patience instead of anger, they become less afraid of failure. When they see forgiveness instead of blame, they become more willing to tell the truth. Looking back, I realized that our apology days earlier had quietly created this very moment. If we had continued living in silence, would our daughter have felt safe enough to apologize so honestly? I wasn't sure. Life continued moving forward as autumn slowly turned colder. Bright orange leaves covered sidewalks throughout our neighborhood. Every evening families walked their dogs while children played in nearby parks before sunset. One thing I always appreciated about many American communities was how much they encouraged family activities. Local libraries hosted reading nights. Schools organized family events. Parks filled with parents and children spending time together. Watching those simple moments reminded me that strong communities are built one family at a time. And strong families are built one conversation at a time. At home, our English practice also changed. Instead of studying separately, we started reading short English stories together after dinner. Nothing complicated. Just simple sentences spoken slowly enough for everyone to enjoy. Sometimes our daughter laughed at funny words. Sometimes my husband helped with pronunciation. Sometimes I made mistakes and everyone laughed, including me. Months earlier, I would have felt embarrassed. Now those mistakes became part of the fun. That may have been the biggest transformation of all. When people no longer fear making mistakes, they begin learning faster. Educational researchers have found that emotional safety improves learning because the brain spends less energy protecting itself and more energy building new memories. Suddenly, I understood why our English practice had become easier. It wasn't because the lessons had changed. It was because our home had changed. One evening, while putting our daughter to bed, she looked at me and asked a question so simple that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Mom, are you and Dad happy again?" I smiled gently. "Yes," I answered. She hugged her favorite teddy bear tightly and whispered, "Good. I like it when everyone smiles." Children have an incredible ability to reduce complicated problems into simple truths.
She didn't ask who had been right.
She didn't ask who had apologized first. She cared only about love returning to our home. After she fell asleep, I quietly stood outside her bedroom door thinking about the future. One day she would grow up. One day she would build relationships of her own. Maybe she would remember these evenings without remembering every detail. Maybe she would simply carry one lasting belief into adulthood, that love is strong enough to survive mistakes when people choose kindness over pride. That night, my husband and I sat together on the back porch watching the stars appear above the quiet neighborhood. Neither of us spoke very much. We didn't need to. Sometimes peace sounds exactly like comfortable silence shared between two people who finally understand each other. As I looked up at the clear American night sky, I realized our journey wasn't ending. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because saying, "I'm sorry," had healed our past, but now we had the opportunity to build something even more valuable, a family where gratitude, forgiveness, and love would become everyday habits rather than rare moments. A new family tradition. Have you ever realized that the happiest families rarely become happy because of one big miracle? They become happy because of hundreds of tiny moments that almost nobody notices. I used to believe that changing our marriage required one unforgettable conversation. That conversation certainly mattered, but what truly transformed our home happened afterward. It was the little habits we repeated every single day that quietly rewrote our family story. Looking back now, I can honestly say that healing didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one peaceful evening at a time. A few weeks after our conversation in the kitchen, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and beautiful. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. The mornings became colder, and the sun rose a little later each day. Before leaving for work, I would stand by the living room window with a warm cup of coffee. They reminded me that life doesn't need to be perfect to be peaceful. One evening, while cleaning the dinner table together, my husband smiled and asked a simple question. "What was the best part of your day?" It wasn't a deep question. It wasn't planned. But instead of giving a quick answer, we actually talked. I told him about a kind customer who had thanked me for helping her at work. He shared a funny story about one of his coworkers accidentally sending an email to the entire office instead of one person. We both laughed. Then our daughter excitedly told us that her teacher had placed a gold star beside her reading assignment. That conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Yet something felt different. For the first time in a long while, we weren't only discussing responsibilities. We were sharing life. The next evening, my husband asked the same question again. Then our daughter started asking it too. Without planning it, we had created a new family tradition. Every evening during dinner, each person shared one good moment from the day. Some days the answers were exciting. Some days they were surprisingly simple. I found a parking space close to work. My coffee tasted really good. I learned a new English word. I helped someone today. Those tiny moments slowly changed the atmosphere inside our home. Positive psychology researchers often explain that practicing daily gratitude helps train the brain to notice positive experiences instead of constantly searching for problems. The difficulties of life don't disappear, but our attention gradually becomes more balanced. I wasn't thinking about scientific studies while sitting at the dinner table. I was simply watching our family smile more often. Around the same time, we created another habit that became one of my favorites. Every night after dinner, we spent 20 minutes reading simple English stories together. Since improving my English had always been one of my personal goals after moving to the United States, I wanted learning to become something joyful instead of stressful. We chose stories with slow, clear sentences. Sometimes I read aloud. Sometimes my husband read. Sometimes our daughter proudly read one short paragraph all by herself. Whenever someone mispronounced a word, nobody laughed to embarrass them. Instead, we laughed together, corrected the pronunciation, and continued reading. That small difference changed everything. Our living room slowly became a place where mistakes were welcomed because they meant someone was learning. Educational experts often say that people remember information better when learning feels emotionally safe. Looking back, I believe that was exactly what happened in our home. English stopped feeling like another challenge. It became part of our family time. Every new word carried not only meaning but also a memory. As winter arrived, holiday lights began appearing throughout our neighborhood. One evening we decided to walk after dinner to enjoy the decorations. Houses glowed with warm white lights, colorful wreaths decorated front doors, and children laughed while building snowmen in nearby yards. One of the things I love about living in America is how neighborhoods often come alive during the holiday season. Even strangers smile at each other while admiring Christmas lights. Those simple traditions reminded me that communities, just like families, grow stronger through shared moments rather than grand gestures. Halfway through our walk, our daughter suddenly reached for both of our hands. She held my hand with one hand. She held her father's hand with the other. Then she looked up and said something that stopped both of us. "I like it when we walk together." Such a simple sentence. Yet it carried more meaning than she probably realized. Children don't usually remember expensive gifts. They remember feelings. They remember whether home felt safe. They remember laughter around the dinner table. They remember bedtime stories. They remember parents holding hands. As we continued walking beneath the glowing holiday lights, I quietly realized that our greatest achievement wasn't saving one difficult conversation. It was creating an environment where love could quietly grow every ordinary day. Those little habits, sharing gratitude, practicing English together, laughing at mistakes, taking evening walks, were slowly becoming part of our family's identity. When we finally returned home that night, I looked around our living room and smiled. Nothing inside the house had become more expensive. We hadn't moved into a larger home. We hadn't won the lottery. Yet somehow, everything felt richer. Because happiness had quietly stopped being something we waited for. It had become something we practiced together. And although our family felt stronger than ever before, I still had one final lesson to learn. It wasn't about communication anymore. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about discovering that two simple words spoken with complete sincerity could continue changing lives long after they were first spoken. The two words that changed everything. What if the most powerful words you will ever speak are not the longest, the smartest, or the most impressive, but the simplest? For months, I believed that saying, "I'm sorry," was the end of my journey. I couldn't have been more mistaken. Those two words didn't end our story. They became the beginning of an entirely different life. Looking back now, I realize that an apology is like planting a tiny seed. At first, nothing seems to happen. But with patience, kindness, and consistency, that tiny seed quietly grows into trust, joy, and a love stronger than before. Winter slowly faded, and the first signs of spring began appearing across our neighborhood. Small flowers pushed through the cold ground, trees slowly turned green again, and birds returned every morning with cheerful songs outside our bedroom window. Nature seemed to whisper the same lesson I had been learning all year. Every season changes eventually. Pain does not stay forever. Neither does silence. Life was still busy, of course. My husband continued working long hours. I balanced work, family responsibilities, and my daily English practice. Our daughter grew more confident at school and proudly brought home reading assignments that she couldn't wait to share with us. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary American family living an ordinary life. But inside our home, something extraordinary had quietly happened. Trust had returned. Not because we had become perfect, because we had become honest. One Friday evening, after dinner, we decided to look through old photo albums. We laughed at pictures from our first apartment, our first family road trip, and our daughter's first birthday party. Some photographs reminded us of wonderful memories. Others reminded us of difficult seasons that we had somehow survived together. Then my husband held up one photo taken several years earlier. "We almost forgot this trip," he laughed. I smiled as memories came rushing back. That vacation hadn't actually gone very well. We had argued about directions, gotten lost twice, and spent hours driving through heavy rain before finally reaching our hotel. Yet somehow, years later, none of us remembered the arguments first. We remembered the laughter. That realization fascinated me. Our brains naturally hold on to emotional meaning more than perfect details. Researchers studying memory have discovered that people often remember how experiences made them feel more than the exact sequence of events. Suddenly, I understood why forgiveness matters so much. It slowly changes which memories become the strongest ones. The mistakes become smaller. The love becomes larger. A few weeks later, something happened at work that tested everything I had learned. I accidentally misunderstood an important email and completed the wrong assignment. The mistake created extra work for several coworkers. My first reaction felt familiar. My heart raced. My mind immediately searched for excuses. Maybe the instructions hadn't been clear enough. Maybe someone else should have explained the project differently. Then I stopped. I smiled quietly to myself. Months earlier, that version of me would probably have defended every decision. Instead, I walked directly to my manager. "I'm sorry," I said. "I misunderstood the instructions. I'll fix it." My manager smiled kindly. "Thank you for telling me," she replied. "Everyone makes mistakes. Let's solve it together." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. There was no embarrassment.
No blame.
No drama. Driving home that evening, I realized something remarkable. Learning to apologize inside my marriage had slowly changed every relationship in my life. I listened better. I became less defensive. I worried less about appearing perfect. Ironically, the less I tried to protect my image, the more confident I actually became. Psychologists often describe this as emotional resilience, the ability to recover from mistakes without allowing shame to define your identity. People with strong emotional resilience don't avoid failure. They simply recover more quickly because they understand that making mistakes is part of growing. That evening, our family took another walk through the neighborhood just as the sun began setting. The sidewalks were filled with blooming flowers, children rode bicycles, and neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Our daughter skipped a few steps ahead before suddenly turning around. "Mom," she asked. "Yes, when I make mistakes when I'm older. Do you think I'll be okay?" I smiled. Not because I knew she would never. I knelt beside her and gently answered, "You'll be okay because mistakes don't decide who you are. What you choose to do afterward does." She nodded thoughtfully before reaching for my hand again. As we continued walking together beneath the golden spring sky, I quietly reflected on everything this journey had taught me. I had moved to America believing that success depended on learning a new language. Instead, life had given me a much deeper lesson. The most meaningful conversations are not measured by difficult vocabulary. They are measured by honesty, humility, and love. Those two simple words, "I'm sorry." They had repaired a marriage,
Strengthened a family.
changed the way our daughter understood kindness, even transformed the person I saw every morning in the mirror. And although I believed that was the end of the lesson, one final realization was still waiting for me, a truth so simple that I wished I had learned it years earlier. And it would become the perfect ending to this unforgettable journey. Love speaks clearly. If you've stayed with me until this moment, let me ask you one final question. Years from now, when the people you love remember you, what will they remember most? Your perfect English? Your biggest achievements? Or the way they felt whenever they were with you? I used to believe that success meant becoming more capable, more confident, and more accomplished. After everything my family and I experienced in the United States, I discovered a completely different truth. The strongest people are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones brave enough to turn mistakes into moments of love, growth, and connection. As another year quietly passed, our family settled into a life that felt wonderfully ordinary. We still woke up early on weekdays. We still hurried through busy mornings, packed lunches, drove to work and school, and returned home tired in the evenings. From the outside, nothing about our lives looked extraordinary. We were simply another family living in a peaceful American neighborhood. Yet inside our home, something invisible had completely changed. Peace no longer depended on having a perfect day. It depended on how we chose to treat one another when the day wasn't perfect. Every evening, we continued our little traditions. We shared one good thing that had happened during the day. We read simple English stories together. Sometimes we laughed because someone pronounced a difficult word in a funny way. Sometimes our daughter corrected my pronunciation, and we all laughed even harder. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I thanked her. Those small moments reminded me that learning never truly ends, no matter how old we become. Whether we are learning English or learning how to love better, progress always begins with the courage to admit that we still have something to learn. One afternoon, while organizing old papers in the living room, I found the notebook where I had once practiced writing the words, "I'm sorry." The pages looked almost untouched except for that one sentence repeated over and over again. I smiled quietly as I turned the pages. Months earlier, I believed those words represented my greatest weakness. Now, they reminded me of one of the strongest decisions I had ever made. I didn't throw the notebook away. Instead, I placed it back on the shelf. Not because I still needed to practice apologizing, because it reminded me that growth often begins with one honest decision repeated consistently over time. Behavioral scientists often explain that lasting happiness rarely comes from dramatic life changes. Instead, it grows through repeated daily habits that strengthen relationships, reduce unnecessary stress, and create emotional security. Looking around my home, I realized I was living proof of that idea. One apology became one conversation. One conversation became one new habit. Those habits slowly became a healthier marriage. That marriage created a more peaceful home. That peaceful home gave our daughter a safer place to grow. Real transformation had never happened overnight. It had happened one ordinary day after another. Several weeks later, our daughter came home from school carrying a small writing assignment. Her teacher had asked every student to write about someone they admired. She handed me the paper with a proud smile. I slowly began reading. My mom teaches me that making mistakes is okay because we can always be kind afterward. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Out of everything she could have written, that was the lesson she chose to remember. Not where we lived, not what we owned, not what job I had. She remembered kindness. Tears quietly filled my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. In that single sentence, I realized that children are always writing invisible stories about their parents. Every conversation, every apology, every act of patience becomes another sentence inside those stories. We may never know exactly which moments they will remember, but we always have the opportunity to shape those memories with love. That evening, our family walked to a nearby hill where we often watched the sunset. The sky slowly transformed into beautiful shades of orange, pink, and deep blue. A cool breeze moved gently through the trees while birds flew toward their nests. We stood there together, without speaking for several minutes. Sometimes silence is no longer painful. Sometimes silence simply means everyone feels completely at home. As I watched the sun disappear beyond the horizon, I thought back to the woman I had been at the beginning of this journey. She believed saying, "I'm sorry," would make her smaller. She was wrong. Those 2 words didn't reduce me. They expanded my heart. They strengthened my marriage. They gave my daughter a better example. They helped me become a better listener, a better partner, a better parent, and even a better English learner because I finally understood that communication is never only about vocabulary. The most beautiful language in the world is meaningless if it cannot carry honesty, compassion, and forgiveness. So if you're listening to this story while practicing your English today, I hope you'll remember something far more important than pronunciation. Don't be afraid of simple words. Sometimes the smallest sentences carry the greatest power. Thank you. I understand. I forgive you. And perhaps the bravest words of all,
I'm sorry.
those words may not change the whole world overnight, but they might completely change someone's world, including your own. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you won't miss the next one.